Welcome everybody. In this video, we are going to explore presidential approval ratings. These ratings have become a common tool for evaluating presidential performance, and the common dynamics that have emerged over the course of several presidencies have become important for understanding not only how the public views presidents, but also for understanding the strategic calculations of presidents and others in the political system. So to start off, let's make sure we're all clear about what presidential approval ratings are. Simply put, presidential approval ratings are measures resulting from public opinion surveys in which pollsters ask a question, generally worded along the lines of, do you approve or disapprove of the job Joe Biden is doing as president? This type of survey question has been frequently asked throughout a president's term, dating as far back as the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, when modern scientific public opinion surveys were innovated by the Gallup organization. Since that time, and especially in the past 20 years or so, many more polling organizations have joined the fray, such that new presidential approval ratings are published on pretty much a daily basis now. Each individual survey is merely a snapshot in time, but accumulated over time and across pollsters, we can learn some interesting things about how the public views presidential job performance. While an individual president's approval ratings may fluctuate in ways that might seem somewhat haphazard, our long polling history of presidential approval has revealed some common dynamics that tend to hold sway from one presidency to the next. In other words, these are dynamics of the public's view of presidents that tend to be less about the characteristics of the specific individuals who hold the office and more about the political system more broadly. So the first common dynamic is that of the honeymoon period. Presidents commonly begin their terms with high levels of public approval, often considerably higher than the percentage of the public that voted for them in the presidential election. A new president taking office becomes a symbol of national unity, of the strength of American democracy, with a peaceful transition of power that had been undisputed for over a century and a half until Donald Trump's lies and incitement of a riot at the U.S. Capitol to prevent an orderly succession. But the pomp and circumstance of a presidential inauguration nicely encapsulates how a new president benefits personally from the symbolic nature of the presidency as an icon of American democracy. Now, I know the image on this slide is a little bit dated, but shown here during Reagan's inaugural are superstars of the entertainment world, including Ray Charles, Frank Sinatra, and Elizabeth Taylor. Now, I know these names might not mean much to a younger generation today, but believe me when I say, that's some pretty serious star power. Something that a Republican president in today's world could only dream of attracting to their inaugural. The point is that a new president's term coincides with a celebration of American democracy, and a president's initial public approval rating gets tied up with that. While presidents may begin their terms riding high with broad public support, they very quickly tend to bump up against some political realities. Presidents tend to experience a decline in their approval ratings relatively early in their terms, a phenomenon that has been coined the decay curve. As presidents actually begin to develop a record of governance, inevitably their accomplishments start to fall short of the promises that they made out on the campaign trail. Members of the public who may have voted for another candidate become less willing to give the new guy a free pass, so to speak. And even many people who voted for the new president begin to become disillusioned when the inevitable legislative grind with Congress begins to wear on. Shown in this slide are President Biden's approval ratings, that's the green squiggly line, beginning with his inauguration up until early September 2022, compared with his 6 immediate predecessors over the same length of time at the beginning of their terms. Presidents Trump, Obama, Clinton, and Reagan all experienced pretty significant decay in their public approval ratings from the time they took office to the kickoff of the midterm congressional election campaign season in the latter part of their second year in office. all of them well south of 50% approval by that time. The major exceptions to this trend were George W. Bush, whose approval ratings were still very high 1 year after 9/11, and his father, George H.W. Bush. That one I don't have a clean explanation for. He somehow managed to maintain very high approval ratings throughout his first 2 years in office. Another common dynamic of presidential approval ratings is the partisan wedge, which is the difference in approval between members of the public affiliated with the president's party versus those affiliated with the opposing major party. The partisan wedge has always existed, but recently that wedge has grown into a canyon. On the table in this slide, we can see the average approval ratings of the last 13 presidents by members of the public in the president's own party and by members of the public who belong to the opposing party. Subtract one from the other, and you can see the difference in how presidents are viewed in light of the lens of party. A couple things that I'd like you to take note of in this table. Generally speaking, presidents can count on high levels of support within their own party. As you can see here, 9 of the 13 presidents in this table received own party approval in the 80%, between 80 and 88%. That dynamic of high levels of own party support has remained relatively stable over time. What has changed has been the view of members of the opposing party. If you look at the bottom 2 rows here, it's wild to think that Eisenhower and Kennedy gained the approval of nearly half the opposing party over the course of their terms, whereas our most recent presidents get opposing party support only in the single digits. Starting with Bill Clinton, who had the highest partisan wedge score ever recorded up to that time, with a difference of 53% in terms of approval by Democrats versus approval by Republicans. Each president since President Clinton has since recorded a new all-time high partisan wedge, with George W. Bush at 58%, President Obama at 67%, and President Trump at an 80% differential between members of the two parties. Thus far, President Biden's partisan differential is just below that of Trump's. We'll have to see how it plays out going forward. The main point here is that as partisan polarization has grown since the 1990s, the symbolic power of the presidency to build broad-based public support has really suffered. Generally, presidents make a concerted effort to emphasize that they represent all the people, with Donald Trump being the notable exception to that. But yet, more and more of those efforts are falling upon deaf ears. One last common dynamic of the public's approval or disapproval of presidents is the rally round the flag effect. While the decay curve and partisan wedge tend to doom presidents to declining approval over time, the rally round the flag effect works in the opposite direction, giving the president at least a temporary bounce in public approval. These bounces tend to occur during times of high national drama, especially when the country is experiencing significant external threats. George W. Bush saw some of the most pronounced bumps in public approval since the advent of public opinion surveys. During his first year in office, he was experiencing the general trend of gradual decline, with approval in the low 50s. But following the September 11th attacks, his approval rating shot up to 90%, the highest ever recorded for a U.S. president. It's hard to overstate what a shocking and galvanizing moment 9/11 was. Responding to those terrorist attacks completely dwarfed whatever partisan differences existed between Democrats and Republicans, at least for a while. And the symbolic importance of the presidency as a personification of the nation translated into almost unanimous support for President Bush. As the country got further and further away from those attacks, the bounce that President Bush received gradually began to decline. But he was again buoyed by another rally around the flag effect when he launched the invasion of Iraq in March 2003, and gained yet another bounce when Saddam Hussein was captured at the end of that year. The thing about these bounces, though, is that they tend to wear off. While the public will rally around nearly any president at the start of a crisis, as time wears on, and as the president's response to the crisis gains its detractors, the gravitational pull, if you will, of the decay curve and partisan wedge start to take over once again. So to bring this all together, why does it matter that there are these common dynamics that seem to be at work for one presidency after another? Well, presidents, as well as others in the political system, are aware of this dynamic, and it has an impact on their strategic decision making. Perhaps most importantly, new incoming presidents recognize that they really have to hit the ground running. The honeymoon period offers them their best opportunity to get action on their legislative agenda. FDR's first 100 days in office have become almost mythical in importance in terms of a president taking dramatic action at the beginning of his term. Now all presidents are expected to have a first 100-day game plan for how to get their biggest agenda items enacted, or at least well on their way to enactment at the very start of a president's term. Another way these dynamics affect political decision making has to do with midterm congressional elections. The decay curve, among other factors, tends to act to the detriment of the president's party at the midterm elections 2 years into the president's term. The president's party tends to suffer losses, especially in the House of Representatives in midterm elections. Knowing that this is as close to a scientific law as we get in political science, members of the president's party tend to jump ship, retiring from office rather than face possible defeat in a re-election attempt. It's a bit odd when you think about it. When President Obama took office, it gave Democrats unified control of the federal government for the first time in 14 years. You would think Democrats in Congress would be excited to get to work actually passing the Democratic agenda after being in the minority for so long. Yet many prominent Democrats in Congress retired before the 2010 midterm elections, exacerbating the party's losses in that election. Similarly, when Donald Trump took office, it represented the first time Republicans had unified control of the federal government for a decade. Yet a massive Republican retirements in the House foretold doom for the Republican majority following the 2018 midterms. So knowledge of these dynamics can become a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Congressional members of the president's party know that declining public approval of the president makes it harder for the president's party to do well in midterm elections. So those members of Congress become more likely to retire, thus making it easier for the opposing party to win those seats in the midterms.